Ms. Subramani.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, if we may call Mr. Neil Roy to be cross-examined.
Again, Mr. Roy, give us your full names.
The full name's Neil Bernard Roy.
So the evidence you're going to give us will be the truth, nothing else but the truth. And if you do, please raise your right hand and say, so help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Mr. Roy.
Good morning.
Mr. Roy, the questions I will ask you this morning in order to elicit further information, not just for further context of the disaster that was the Usindiso building fire, but also for the purpose of lessons learned going forward in order to address further disasters. I will be addressing you in your role, as you described, as at the time of the fire, you were the acting Deputy Director of Disaster Management who reported to the Director within Public Safety. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you so much. Mr. Roy, you described disaster management services as a sister department to EMS. That implies that there's some level of collaboration and cooperation in your roles as two departments. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. There is a note in approaching disasters. I note that where EMS would be a first responder, that disaster management comes in as a secondary support to complement those services. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. In terms of classification, there has been much talk about the Usindiso fire being classified as an incident as opposed to a disaster. Would the classification as an incident as opposed to disaster have an effect on the resources provided to address such an incident and or disaster?
No, it won't, because once you do a classification, it is normal. It's normally after the assessment, so it's after the fact. There are two ways of classifying, which is in terms of if it's a sudden or a slow onset. In this case, it was not slow onset, it was sudden, it happened. We were called out. So it will not fall under slow onset. In the slow onset, yes, you can then do the preparatory work.
Thank you. Would this classification have an effect on the budget provided and resource provided after the fire, once these assessments have been made? Is there a difference in the level of resource provided to an incident versus a disaster? I'm also, sorry, need to pause for translation.
Thank you, Chair. Ake ngamanje ngemva kwekhefu kuqale ngokuthi umnumzane uRoy ongufakazi enze izifungo ngokuphakamisa isandla sakhe sangakwesokudla ebese funga ukuthi uzokhuluma iqiniso lodwa. Khona ke ummeli ube esendlalela lolu daba ngokuthi aqale asho ukuthi akazungena kabanzi endabeni yezokulawulwa kwezinhlekelele, kodwa ufuna ukugxila ezifundweni ezitholakele neziyezatholakala ekufundweni kwalesi sigameko somlilo wosindiso. Ubeke ummeli esekubeka phambi kwakhe ukuthi okokuqala ngesikhathi kwenzeka lesi sigameko wayeyiphini lomqondisi kulomnyango wezinhlekelele. Uvumile ukuthi yebo ngaleso sikhathi wayeyiphini, kodwa ebika kumqondisi omkhulu obhekelele ukulawulwa kwezinhlekelele. Ubeke futhi esekubeka phambi kwakhe ukuthi bona njengomnyango olawulwa ezinhlekelele basebenzelana eduze ne-EMS ukuchaze njengoza kwabo noma udadewabo, okusho ukuthi bayabambisana. Uvumile futhi nalapho ukuthi kunokubambisana phakathi kwabo. Kodwa ke manje ubesefaka umbuzo ufakazi ukuthi ekugcineni kukhona izinto ezimbili. Kukhona into okuthiwa isigameko nokuthiwa inhlekelele, incident ne disaster. Ubesebuza ukuthi niyakuhlukanisa yini lokhu noma nakuhlukanisa yini kulesi sikhathi ukuthi lesi isigameko lena inhlekelele. Ufakazi ushilo ukuthi cha asikwazi ukuhlukanisa phela uma kusenzeka ngoba sisuke singazi ukuthi kuzoba njani. Ngakho indlela esisabela ngayo iyafana ngoba sisuke singakakwazi ukubona. Size sikwazi ukuhlukanisa ngemva kokuba sekwenzekile. Ufakazi uchazile ukuthi zimbili inhlobo eziba khona. Kukhona isigameko esenzeka kancane kancane. Bese kuba khona isigameko esivele senzeke ngaso leso sikhathi. Ngakho uma sibheka esasosindiso azange senzeke kancane kancane sibanike ithuba lokuthi bakuhlomele. Kodwa savele senzeka nje ngalolo suku okwenzeka ngaso. Ubeke sembuzo umbuzo wokugcina ummeli ukuthi akakade achazeke endabeni yesabelo mali ukuthi ngabe siyayithinta yini ibudget uma kuziwa kuloko kuhlukaniswa kwenhlekelele eza kancane kancane noma evele nje iqubuke yenzeke ngaleso sikhathi. Yilapho ke esemi khona njengamanje.
Mr. Roy, would you like me to quickly repeat the
Yes,
question?
yes, please.
That's fine. With the classification as an incident as opposed to a disaster, in terms of providing resource to the affected victims after the fire, would that have an effect on the budget and resource provided? Or is it done to the scale of the victims who are affected?
No, in terms of the classification itself, that happened within the line function. The line function will say it's an emergency or it's an incident, and that line function then in terms of their planning of resources, because when you say resources, it's, I assume it's the response to the incident, and that is a function of EMS. So they do the planning in terms of worst case scenarios. We have various scenarios. We have fire, we have flooding, we have earth tremors, we have various of those. So they will then plan for the different incidents. So it's not to say when there's a classification in terms of the Disaster Management Act, because we have two words, which is the classification and the declaration. So when we do a classification, it doesn't mean there will be more resources to the incident, no. It'll be the management of the after effects, of the impact.
Thank you so much.
Ubeke sembuza ummeli ukuthi njengoba kukhulunywa ngezinsiza eziye zihlinzekwe ingabe lokuhlukanisa ukuthi into isigameko nje zangaleso sikhathi noma inhlekelele kuyakuba nomthelela yini ekuhlinzekweni kwalezo zinsiza. Ufakazi uyachaza ukuthi kunalokho kubizwa ukuthi line function. Uma echaza uthi kuye kwenziwa uhlelo, lolu hlelo ke alwenziwa yibo, lwenziwa yi-EMS. EMS iye eqhamuke nalolo hlelo ngoba inhlekelele lezi azifani. Kungaba khona inhlekelele yomlilo, kube khona inhlekelele yezikhukhula noma ukuzamazama komhlaba, tremor okuye kwenzeke ngezikhathi ezithile. Ngakho ke bona njengababhekelele ukulawulwa kweinhlekelele zimbili izinto abaye bazibheke ngoba kukhona lokho kuthiwa i-classification, ngakho ukuhlukanisa ne-declaration. I-declaration ilapho sebehlonza khona ke ukuthi lesi isigameko okufanele sibizwe ukuthi esenhlekelele. Ngakho ilezo zinto ezimbili abaye bazilandele emsebenzini wabo.
Thank you. Mr. Roy, I'm now going to take us prior to the fire, because part of this commission's mandate is examining the circumstances that surrounded the Usindiso building prior to the fire. Mr. Roy, I put it to you that disaster management has a proactive component as part of its functionality. Is that so?
That's correct.
And part of that functionality would include assessing buildings such as the Usindiso buildings or other buildings in the city that would pose similar risks. Is that so?
No, it's to serve as an advisory to the private sector, to NGOs, to business owners.
So when you say advisory, so an assessment would lead to a report to give what recommendations?
The assessment itself must be done by the building owner. For example, if you do your assessment, you understand your environment, then you submit that emergency plan to disaster management. We will then assist you to work through it if you need people to be trained and so forth within that building. That's what we assist and advise on.
Would it be correct to say that building owners have an obligation to ensure that kind of assessment is done?
they have an obligation in terms of the building regulations, and there are various other direct legislation that compel them to do it. But in terms of disaster management, it is an advisory service. It's a may, it's not a must, so we just assist.
Ubeke esekuthula futhi ummeli ekubeka phambi kwakhe ukuthi ufuna ukugxila manje ngaphambi kwalesi sigameko sokuqubuka komlilo nezimo ezazithinta leso sikhathi kubo njengomnyango olawula ezinhlekelele. Manje umbuzile ke ukuthi ingabe nina njengomnyango obekelwe ukulawula izinhlekelele ingabe niyahamba yini niyokwenza lokho kuthiwa ukuhlaziya noma ukuhlola assess iability bese niphuma nezincomo kulona. Ufakazi uthi cha akusiwo umsebenzi wethu ukuhamba siyohlola iability sil assess cha thina singabeluleki thina siyabeluleka abantu seluleka inkampani ezizimele ezinamability ukuthi nansi into okufanele ziyenze. Umnikazi weability uye okufanele aqiniseke ukuthi iability lisesimweni esihle bese eqhamuka nohlelo olubhaliwe phansi ukuthi nalo uhlelo esibhekele ngalo ukunqanda inhlekelele ubese liletha kithi ke njengomnyango lawula inhlekelele thina bese simeluleka ukuthi yini angayenza. Kodwa nalapho ke phela akuyona indaba yokuthi kufanele akwenze kodwa angakwenza uma ethanda. Ngamanye amazwi it's not a must but he may do it uma ethanda ngokusho kwakhe elawulwa ke imithetho ebekiwe esebenzayo.
Are there any parties other than an owner who may approach disaster management for an assessment? And that, such as a councillor or a government department that may want to approach to ensure that a plan is created?
Yes, it's allowed.
Does this happen in the usual course?
We had some building owners that have come, but then there are prerequisites. For example, they must go to fire safety first. Remember, the building must be on code before we start our work. Sometimes we do it parallel, so that we can do the trainings and those things. But there must be a prerequisite, which is that certificate that they must get.
Thank you so much, Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, would you be in a position to give more insight into the so-called problematic building task team, where once a building that does pose a risk is identified, the actions that are generally recommended to be taken? Because I do note you said that there's an advisory role that disaster management plays.
Yeah, no, there's a leader of that task team, and that task team, there's some information that they don't share necessarily with the rest of the team member because, as you know, it's investigative. So they will be the best people to give you insight on it.
Thank you.
Ubeke ummeli esemcela ukuthi noma ambuze ukuthi njengoba ngaphambili ethe umnikazi webilidi uyo kufanele aqhamuke nohlelo bese eliletha kubo bona bameluleke. Umbuzo ke ukuthi ingabe umnikazi webilidi kuphela yini onomthwalo wokwenza lokho noma omunye umuntu njengekhansela naye angaqhamuka azokwenza lokho kubona abafika abanika uhlelo lwalelo bilidi. Ufakazi umnumzana uRoy uthi yebo noma ubani angakwenza noma kungesena umnikazi webilidi noma ikhansela lingakwenza lokho kulungile ukuthi lingazobika ngalokho kodwa ke kuneyinyathelo phela okufanele zilandelwe. Ngokwesibonelo kungahle kudingeka aqale eminyangweni wabazomlilo ngoba ibona abasebenza ngalokho bese bekubheka ke ngaphambi kokuba kudlulele kubo bese benikeza izeluleko ngalokho. Ube umele sebuza umbuzo wesibili ukuthi ingabe kukhona yini abakwenzayo noma yini eyenziwa ileli thimba elibhekelela lokho kubizwa ngokuthi amability ayinkinga lenzani lelo thimba. Zikhona yini izinyathelo elizithathayo azaziyo. Ufakazi uthi yebo ngokwazi kwakhe leli thimba liyasebenza kodwa leli thimba linomholi walo okuyena oqokelwe ukuthi asebenze. Ngakho kuleli thimba ke nabo banemfihlo ezinye zezinto abangazidaluli phela ngoba izikhathi eziningi basuke benza uphenyo. Ngakho umuntu ongachaza kabanzi ngaleyo task team noma lelo thimba eliqokelwe lokho umholi wayo ngokwayo uyo ongadalula ezinye izinto yena ngokwakhe angeke akwazi ukudalula konke ngomsebenzi owenziwa yilona.
Mr. Roy, prior to the Usindiso fire, had there been any engagements with a task team such as the one described in relation to the Usindiso building, or any assessments that would have examined the safety risks, to your knowledge?
Yeah, no, once a building is, there's been handed over to the problematic task team, your role ceased in terms of doing further inspections and assisting or whatever you need to do, because then it means it'll be conflicting to what they want to achieve. So, no, because they continue with what they're supposed to do.
Thank you. Mr. Roy, I'm now going to move to the night of the fire, and I do note from your statement the timelines that you provided that after the initial fire was reported and the firefighting happened, you were alerted around 3:10 in the morning and then responded to then attend to the site and assist victims. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And that part of the procedure was compiling a list of victims in order to establish the need of either resource, shelter, or accommodations for the victims of the fire. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is it correct, Mr. Roy, that the victims of the fire were offered either temporary emergency shelter or alternative accommodation if they could arrange it themselves?
No, we didn't offer them. We gave them an option
Okay.
to say we can provide you accommodation, emergency shelter, if you don't have one, but we didn't give them the alternative.
I note from your statement that the provision of emergency shelter was limited to 3 sites where the cumulative capacity was 250 or so.
Yes.
Additionally, your report states that you identified 168 households made up of 422 individuals. Is that correct?
That was on site, yes,
That's
that's
on
correct, yes.
Was the capacity constraints provided by the 3 sites, and I'm going to take you back to that figure of 250, was that informed by the victims volunteering to come to emergency shelters, or was it a physical constraint that disaster management had to contend with?
If we can just separate the words sites,
Yes.
because the site is Daidang 80, Daidang Alberts, that's the
Okay.
first site, and then the shelter.
Yes, the
It's
shelters.
the one, so that we don't have the sites. When we were on site, we provided the buses, and there were, Daidang, initially, I think we arranged 4 buses. And then the people on site refused to go onto the buses, wanted to know where, and we explained. And then 3 buses left, and we got 1 bus left. So when we left the site, then 80 Alberts, for the shelter, for the first shelter, that's when we had about, I think, 60 or close to, I can't remember the number, but it was not the same number that you are reading there. It was a lesser number.
So it wasn't 422 individuals who needed to be placed that night?
No, that's, yeah, no.
Okay.
Ubeke ufaka ummeli esekhuluma ngaleli thimba sithi libhekelele la mability ayinkinga, ubuzile ukuthi ngokwazi kwakhe kwaba khona yini ukuxoxisana ukuxhumana bona nalo leli qembu noma ukukhulumisana nalabo ababhekelele lamabhilidi abuchazwa njengamabhilidi ayinkinga noma le task team, uthi cha isizathu salokho ukuthi uma nje umsebenzi sewubekwe ezandleni zaleli thimba noma le task team ukuthi ayibhekane nalomsebenzi, bona babe sebenqindeka ke ababe besakwazi ukuqhubeka ngoba phela umsebenzi usuku ususezandleni zale task team ukuthi ayiqhubeke nayo, ngoba uma bengangena kuyobe sengathi baphazamisa ukusebenza kwayo. Ingakho ke ethi cha ngokolwazi lwakhe akazi ke ngoba lo msebenzi noma leli bhilidi laselivele lethulwe kuleli thimba elisebenza ngokubhekelela lamabhilidi abizwa ngokuthi anenkinga adinga usizo. Ubese dlula ke lapho ummeli wangena odabeni lwesibili lwangosuku lwesigameko noma usuku lomlilo. Okokuqala uthi ngokwestatement sakhe wathola ucingo ufakazi cishe ngo10:03 umtshela ukuthi kunalesi sigameko wabe sebabela khona ke uma ethola lolo cingo nangempela uma efika khona wabe seyakha uhlu waqoqa izinto abantu ababezidinga ngaleso sikhathi ummeli uyasho ukuthi ngesikhathi nilapho ke iziphi izinto ke enabe senizixoxa nabantu kakhulukazi ukubahlinzeka ngezinto uthi ummeli cha asizange sibahlinzeke thina sibatshela ukuthi kunendawo yesikhashana eningaya kuyo noma indawo eningayokhoseliswa kuyo cha zange senze njalo kodwa sabanika lokho kuthiwa ioption ukuthi ningazikhethela ukuthi nakho esikubeka etafuleni nina nidinga indawo yesikhashana engenayo nansi ngakho sabakhethisa ukuthi kuphi abakhethayo ube futhi esefuna ukucacisa ngoba ulimi belokhu likhuluma lihlanganisa izinto ezimbili ukuthi kukhona i-site ne-shelter ucelile ukuthi ake sikucaciseke ukuthi uma sikhuluma nge-site sikhuluma ngendawo lapho kwaqubuka khona umlilo eAlbert Street yona indawo esibiza ngokuthi i-site kodwa uma sesikhuluma nge-shelter sesikhuluma ngalapho esabasa khona ke ngokwesigango kwendawo okwatholakala kuyo kwatholakala ukuthi kuneyindawo ezintathu abezibeke eceleni njengeyindawo abazobasa kuzo noma ke ama shelter ke lawo abebezobasa kuyo bathola ukuthi lapha ya kunabantu abangaba ngu122 phakathi kwabo kwakuyo imindeni engu168 eyayikhona ngakho ke uyabuza ukuthi nakwazi yini ukubathatha bonke labantu nibayise kulezo indawo ufakazi uyasho ukuthi into esafike sayenza ngalobu busuku thina uma sesifikile esigamekweni safika namabhasi amane sabacela ke abantu ukuthi njengoba nini ngenayo indawo nanka amabhasi amane gibelani ke anihambise kulezo indawo uthi baqale benqaba ukuthi ngoba befuna ukwazi ukuthi nisifake emabhasini nje nisisa kuphi kwafanele babachazeleke emva kwalokho amabhasi amathathu abese yaphuma ke kwasala ibhasi elilodwa nakhona uthi kwagcina kuhambe ecisha abantu abangaba amashumi ayisithupha abangu60 kwangaselona leli yanani elalilikhulu labantu ababedinga indawo yokuhlala kodwa laselehlile leli nani cishe selilinganiselwa lapha kubantu abangu60 abavuma ukugcina begibela ibhasi bahamba.
Mr. Roy, after the initial 3 buses, as you described, arrived at the 3 shelters, over the next 72 hours, did further victims arrive at the shelters that were emergency shelters?
Yes, that's correct. From the first night, then after the bus left, around about 9 or so, might be a little before 10, some of the people, because we closed or we removed ourselves from the shelter, and some people arrived overnight. Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Roy, in both your statement and the report, there is a reference repeatedly to a 72-hour period.
Yes.
And that 72-hour period is an international best practice.
That's right.
For a period to address an emergency in the aftermath. Is that correct?
That's correct.
After the 72 hours had elapsed, what permanent solutions were found to house the residents who were in, as you described, emergency shelters?
Yeah, we don't provide permanent solution, that is human settlement. What we do after the 72 hours, we transition then to human settlement to find that, to whatever solution they come up with in terms of housing.
So it's an administrative handover.
That's right.
But factually,
Yes.
the victims remained at the 3 shelters, which may not have been effective long-term solutions, longer term rather than a few days or a single night. Is that correct?
I will not say that all 3 of them were not effective. I will say the Hofland were not suitable, yes.
And you can agree, Mr. Roy, that Hofland actually, the bulk of the victims who were housed in emergency shelters were housed at Hofland as it had the greatest capacity.
That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Roy, is it also correct that the requirements for the facilities, where it's in emergency shelters, are somewhat more relaxed in terms of what is required to simply meet the need of shelter in the immediate 72 hours?
That's correct.
I'll wait for...
Thank you, Chair. Ayike ngemva kwalokho ke ummeli ube ekhuluma ngala amabhasi amathathu asuka kuqala njengoba babefike namabhasi amane ube esebeka phambi kwakho ukuthi lawo mabhasi amane amathathu afika kuqala kulezo indawo ekwakufanele zifike kuwo futhi afika phakathi ube sembuza kuqala ukuthi bakhona yini abantu abafika kodwa ke kulezi zindawo emahoreni angu 72 ushilo ufakazi umnumzana uRoy ukuthi yebo bakhona abantu abafika kulamahora angu 72 ubekode sekugcizelela kancane le ndaba yamahora angu 72 ukuthi ngokwazi kwakhe amahora angu 72 asuke ebekelelwe ukuthi kufanele kuhlinzekwe ngokusheshsha abantu abasuke bedinga usizo empeleni emhlabeni wonke kubekwa nje amahora angu 72 ukuthi phakathi kwamahora angu 72 abantu kufanele balithole usizo kunjalo yini uvumile ufakazi ukuthi yebo umthetho osebenzayo loyo ukuthi abantu kufanele bahlinzekwe ngendawo phakathi nalesi sikhathi kodwa wayesecacisa ukuthi bona njengabantu abalawula izinhlekelele abalokuthi banikeze usizo lwesikhathi esiphelele noma i-permanent solution uthi abanabo bona lokho bona into abasuke beyihlinzeka ngempela kusuke kuyinto esikhashana ngakho ubuzile ukuthi uma manje lamahora angu 72 esephelile esedlulileke la abekiwe kube sekwenzekani ngoba phela mhlawumbe abanye abantu bayafika ngemva kwalokho ubethi ke uma sekuphela amahora angu 72 udaba ke lube seliphuma ke manje kubo so luya eminyangweni wezokuhlaliswa kwabantu noma human settlement iyona manje sokufanele iqhubeke nalokho ngoba bona basuke sebekwenzile okwabo ngalezo zikhathi zezinhlekelele babe sebekhuluma ngalezi indawo ke ezintathu kwakuhlalwa kuzona ikakhulukazi eyase Hofland okuyiyona egxile kakhudlwana ukuthi yayingekho esimweni esihle ukuhlalisa abantu uyavuma ufakazi ukuthi ngempela kunjalo iHofland iyona abagcine ke bephekwayo njengoba simisunda.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, if I'm understanding correctly, the role of disaster management is secondary to the first response. You arrive at the scene, make an assessment, and then, to put it shortly, allocate emergency shelter and attend to that emergency shelter for the period of 72 hours before handing over to human settlements. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in that process of handover to human settlements, is there then a discussion, conversation, and advisement on the capacity constraints that human settlements has after that period of 72 hours?
Yeah, what happens is, maybe if I can explain the process briefly, is that when we put individuals up for humanitarian relief for the 72 hours into the emergency shelter, sometimes it doesn't mean it goes automatically to human settlement. The incident can be handled within that 72 hours and people are integrated. We do that all the time. So it is just in terms of, in this case, human settlement, they have a policy that they will deal with, which is temporary emergency accommodation. And when we do that administrative process, we will say then that in terms of our assessment on the ground, that this incident will take longer than 72 hours, and therefore you guys then have to provide whatever in terms of that policy. They have several, I think it's TATH, there's a lot of them. So they will then make the assessment which type of accommodation and who needs that accommodation. It's not a blanket, they do their own assessment. So that's what happens, yes.
Mr. Roy, are you aware that the victims being housed at shelters such as Hofland and the two other shelters, that for some residents, they were at Hofland from September all the way to mid-November, which is far exceeds, I'm sure you agree, the 72-hour period for an emergency shelter to be used?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Ubeke ummeli eseqhubeka nodaba lwakhe endabeni yendawo zokuhlala ukuthi bona njengomnyango lawula izinhlekelele baba ngabesibili ukufika ngoba kufika bokuqala okuyi EMS bese bayafika uma befika ke bona bafike nabo bahlole babone isimo bese bebona ukuthi bangakwazi ukuhlinzeka abantu ngezindawo zesikhashana zesimo esiphuthumayo bese emva kwalokho uma sebeqedile ukwenza bese bethatha zonke intambo ke bazibuyisele kumnyango wezokuhlaliswa kwabantu okufanele ukwenze lokho banikeze nezeluleko ukuthi nakho thina esikutholile uma senza olwethu ukuhlaziyo kule ndawo yesigameko khona ke ube sebuza umeli ukuthi kodwa manje kuyenzeka phela ezinye izinto uthola ukuthi ziyeqa kulamahora angu 72 nimisa kanjani lapho uchazile ufakazi ukuthi laba be human settlement noma ukuhlaliswa kwabantu banenqubo nabo abayilandelayo uma kule kunesimo esifana nalesi ngakho baye baxoxe nabo kuleyo nqubo yabo ukuthi thina ehlaziyeni kwethu sibonile ukuthi lokhu kungenzeka kuze kuthathe isikhathi esingaphezulu kwamahora angu 72 ngakho exoxeni kwabo ke yilapho bekwazi khona ukuvumelana ukuthi bazosebenza kanjani ngoba kule nqubo mgomo yezokuhlaliswa kwabantu nabo abaveli nje bawole wonke umuntu bayomfunela indawo yokuhlala bamhlalise cha nabo baneyaba indlela yokuhlaziya abantu ukuthi ubani ngempela odinga indawo yokuhlala basebenzise zabi indlela nokuthi udinga hlobo luni lwendawo yokuhlala ubeke umeli manje esekhuluma ngezindawo ukuthi njengoba bona kufanele bahlinzeke into yosizo lwesikhashana olwamahora angu-72 kuphela ngemva kwamahora angu-72 babe sebeyithatha indaba bayinikeze abezokuhlaliswa kwabantu kodwa lapha yakuleli bhilidi laseHofland uyazi yini ufakazi ukuthi khona abantu abafika ngoSeptember lapha bahlala kwaze kwashaya uNovember amahora angu-72 aphela kudala ke uma kunjalo ingabe ubekwazi yini lokho impendulo kafakazi ibe ukuthi yebo.
May I expand on the last response that I've given in terms of the 72 hours? If we can just, because the 72 hours, remember, they pertain to those that were staying at Hofland. And I hear sometimes you say so it's not 3, because the 2 is longer term accommodation, and 72 hours pertain to Hofland. So we must just separate those numbers.
I think for the benefit of the Commission, we should perhaps specify Hofland itself. Hofland was the Hofland Recreation Centre in Bez Valley.
That's correct.
And in terms of creating an emergency shelter, because of Hofland's capacity,
Yes.
the facilities at Hofland, can we agree were not sufficient to house for the longer term 120 to 150 people, as was its capacity?
The capacity was, in terms of the certification we've received, that's why we have, I think the females were staying in the big wall and the gentlemen in the 3 separate rooms. So we swapped them around to put the gentlemen in the bigger hall, and there were ample space there. Yes, as we have said from the beginning, in terms of emergency shelter, of course it won't have all the facilities because you're supposed to be there for a few hours, as we say up to 72 hours, and then put the females and children in the smaller halls, and they didn't even fill up. There were still 2 rooms left. They were just staying in one of the rooms. So yes, it was ample.
But would you say that international best practice had been adhered to once the 72-hour period had elapsed and residents still remained in what was meant to be an emergency shelter that was temporary?
Yeah, if there's still further assessments that need to be done, you have to do those assessments. And as you would know, there was a lot of documentation issues. There were a lot of people need to get some even have to trace their family members and so forth. So yes, in certain circumstances, you extend the 72 hours for those services to be executed.
So how long before there was factual handover to human settlements?
We started the first meeting, if I can recall, I think it was the fourth day, the fourth or fifth day. That's when we started the process. And they also have lists because they started then with their listing and so forth, who must be placed where.
Thank you so much, Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, were the operational difficulties faced in addressing the needs of the victims as a result of, and I'm going to call them constrained resources because there were 2 shelters and then a recreational center used as emergency shelters. Were these operational difficulties faced?
Can you expand on operational difficulties? What do you mean by that?
I mean challenges or difficulties or delays faced in effectively managing the victims, their placement in a secure, stable emergency shelter, and so on.
No, not at all. No, not at all. We were set up. We had tables and the various services, as we called them in, they came with mobile vans, that are set up as maybe off-site offices, for lack of a better word. And there were 2 offices that we utilize, which is the office of operational manager that's on site. We had storeroom facility. There was enough. I don't know what were the operational difficulties. For sure, not from our end.
Okay.
Ubeke ngaphambi kokuba aqhubeke ufakazi wathi ucela ukulungisa indaba ethile lapha ngoba uyamuzwa ummeli lokho ekhuluma ngezindawo ezintathu. Uthi ummeli cha azintathu lezi ndawo iyodwa. Lezi ezimbili vele kwakuyindawo zokuthi abantu bahlala isikhathi eside. Okuyiyona ndawo bona ababethi bagxile kuyona kuyindawo yokuthi indawo nje yokuhlala isikhashana umuntu amana goba amadlangala amahora angu-72. Indawo yase Hofland kuphela. Ngakho akazifaki lezi ezinye. Ngakho ufuna ukulungisa lapho ukuthi akakhulumeli lezi ezinye indawo, ukhulumela nje lena yase Hofland kuphela. Ubeke ummeli sekubeka ke ukuthi angithi Hofland lena indawo kwakubizwa ukuthi Hofland Recreation Center. Ucabanga ukuthi yayanele yini ukuthi ngahlalisa abantu lapha yangaphakathi kuyona, yayisesimweni esikahle ukuhlalisa abantu yini? Ufakazi uthi yebo phela vele umuntu uma ezogoba amadlangala usuke ezodlula engekahlala isikhathi eside. Ngakho engeke ibe nazo zonke izinto. Kodwa lapha ngaphakathi bafike bahlukanisa, bathatha besifazane babafake ehholo elikhulu. Kwaba namakamela amathathu laba behlalisa khona besilisa kuphela. Nakhona bathi ngokuhamba kwesikhathi bakushintsha, bathatha besilisa babaletha kuleli hholo elikhulu. Abesifazane babafaka kulamakamela amathathu. Kwawona bangazange bawagcwalise ngoba bagcina besebenzisa nje kuphela amabili. Ubesedlula kummeli embuza ukuthi ngokomthetho ke obekiwe nje wokuthi abantu kufanele bahlale amahora angu-72 endaweni yesikhashana, angasho yini ufakazi ukuthi walalelwa yini lowo mthetho ngoba phela adlula amahora angu-72 labantu besahlala kuleya ndawo? Uthi ummeli uma ephendula lapho yebo kuyenzeka ukuthi amahora angu-72 adlule uma kusekhona mhlawumbe okunye ukuhlolo olusafuna ukwenziwa kuphenywe, kuyenzeka avudlule amahora angu-72. Khumbula ukuthi laba yabantu njengoba bebeselapha abanye babo babesadukelene nemindeni yabo besayifuna bengakayitholi. Abanye babo ngesikhathi belapha bakusafune kulungiswa indaba zamaphepha, documentation, ukuthi ingaba sesimweni yini. Ngakho kuyinto eyenzekayo ukuthi kudlule kancane kumahora angu-72. Ubesebuza ke ummeli ukuthi kanti kunini ke lapho kwagcina sekuthiwa ke nazo ke intambo kini ninamnyango okuhlaliswa kwabantu, kwenzeka nini lokho ngoba kwenzeka emahoreni angu-72? Ufakazi uthi cishe kwenzeka osukwini lwesine, cishe ngosuku lwesine yilapho kababe sebedlulisela ke ngokusemthethweni ke manje intambo kumnyango wezokuhlaliswa kwabantu ukuthi nabo kabantu sebengaphansi kwenu. Ubeke sekhuluma ngendaba ayibize ngokuthi i-operational difficulties. Athe akakathi ukucacisa ufakazi ngoba akaqonda ukuthi usho ukuthini uma ekhuluma ngalobo bunzima noma ingqinamba. Ufaka ummeli uthe ukumchazela ukuthi cha sengikhuluma nje ngeinselele noma ingqinamba enabhekana nazo uma nizokwenza umsebenzi wenu. Uthi ufakazi lutho azange sibe nazo nje nakancane inkinga thina safika sihlomile sasikulungele, safika nezimoto zethu ezingomahamba nendlwane ezafika zabakhona lapha sasinamahhovisi ayelungela ukusebenza sasine storage sokubeka izinto sokugcina izinto ngakho nje uma kuziwa kulokhu thina zange nje size sibe nenkinga mhlawumbe bakhona baba nayo inkinga kodwa thina azange sibe nezingqinamba konke nje kwashelela.
Mr. Roy, in your report, you do note certain relief or resource provided by external bodies such as MSF and the Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations. In the management of a disaster, is it the norm to coordinate with these external NGOs to assist victims of a tragedy such as the fire?
Yes, it's now.
And in the absence of such interventions, is disaster management equipped, external to the medical care and food and resource provided by donors or volunteers, to effectively address an incident such as the Usindiso building fire?
Again, can you expand on equipped? What do you mean when you say equipped?
Is it able to handle a disaster without external assistance?
Because it is not, this one was not a disaster.
An incident,
It was
rather.
an incident. That's why I'm. As we've been saying from the beginning, it is not for disaster management to walk into an emergency situation or an incident and take over. We support the line function that's on site. And in terms of Direct 80 Alberts, that's why we didn't activate the disaster management center at the first line, second line, or third line. That means there was only me and one or two colleagues to assist Direct later. So we were more than capable and equipped to handle this incident.
I think before I allow for translation, I should just clarify. In the aftermath, when
Yes.
emergency shelter, the management, so to say, of the victims who were under the auspices of disaster management in emergency shelters, would external, or rather to the exclusion of NGO assistance, would disaster management be able to cater to the international best practice standard of assisting victims of an incident, rather, without the intervention of an external source, such as an NGO or humanitarian relief?
Humanitarian relief in terms of how disaster management is designed within the city of Johannesburg. It is not possible because we don't prepare food. That's number one. So we do need non-governmental organizations or civil society organizations to prepare food. And we do provide in terms of, the basics, we provide those. But to blanketly say we'll be able to, no, because there are certain functions we don't do where we depend on the civil society organizations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Ubeke ummeli esekhuluma ngezinsiza ezahlinzekwa ngalolu suku ngoba kubonakala sengathi akubanga umnyango wezokulawulwa kuphela wasiza kodwa kunezinhlangano ezizimele ezangaphandle ezafaka isandla zasiza enye yayo SMF ngakho ubuzile ke ummeli ukuthi kuyinto ejwayelekile yini vele ukuthi uma kuvele isimo esifana nalesi ezinye inhlangano ezizimele ezingenza inzuzo zisifaka isandla uma kudingeka. Uvumile umnumzana uRoy ukuthi hayi kuyinto ejwayelekile leyo ukuthi zisifake isandla uma kudingeka zisize lapho zidingeka khona ke ube esebuza ukuthi ukube bezingekho lezi inhlangano ezifaka usizo ezizimele ezinixhasayo ngesikhathi kwenzeka lokhu benizokwazi yini nina ukuthi nizimele noma nikuhlomele kahle ukwenza lo msebenzi? Yilapho athe ukubuza khona ke ufakazi ukuthi uqonda ukuthini mayekhuluma ngokuba equipped kulomsebenzi wenhlekelele ube sethi isizathu salokhu ukuthi lesiya senzihlakalo esehlela usindiso sasingeyona abasihlonzi bona njengenhlekelele phecelezi idisaster kodwa basibheka njengesehlakalo noma isigameko esenzeka ngakho kunezinto ezimbili abakubizi lokho ngokuthi inhlekelele kodwa isehlakalo ngakho uthi ke uma kunjalo kuyisehlakalo bona ngoba kuyona inhlekelele baya beyonikeza usizo akubona umsebenzi wabo kodwa bafike basize lapho kwehle leso sehlakalo esinjalo bese bebambisana nalabo abadinga ukuthi basizwe ingakho bengazange bayihlonze le yandawo ngokuthi sokuyindawo yenhlekelele noma ba-activate lokho abathi disaster cha ngenxa ukuthi akuyona inhlekelele kodwa i-incident noma isehlakalo utheke ummeli ngaphambi kokuba avumele kutoliwe kunombuzo afuna futhi ukuphinde awubuze ukuthi ke ngemva kokuba sekwehlakeleke isigameko nansi inhlekelele seyenzekile umbuzo wakhe uthi babezokwazi yini bona njengomnyango obhekele izinhlekelele ukunikeza usizo lonke ukube zazingekho lezi inhlangano ezafaka isandla zasiza inhlangano ezingenza inzuzo ezizimele impendulo kafakazi ithi cha sasingeke ngoba phela thina njengomnyango olawula inhlekelele okuqala nje asikupheki ukudla asihlinzeki abantu ngokudla ngakho besingeke sakwazi ukukwenza ngoba ukudla sinakho thina simanje nje senza izinto eziyisisekelo inhlangano zangaphandle ezaletha ukudla zasiza ke so embuzweni wokuthi bekuzokwazi yini ukuthi bayilawule bebodwa impendulo ithi cha bebengeke bebezidinga lezi inhlangano zangaphandle ezizimele enjengalezi ezaletha ukudla zaletha izingubo ngoba bona lezo zinto izinto abangazihlinzeki ngaphansi komnyango wabo.
Thank you so much, Mr. Roy. Madam Chair, no further questions. I know
Thank
I
you.
did go over by a few minutes, and I'll
Thank you,
I will-
Ms. Subramani, for respecting the limitation. Mr. Semenya,
We have no questions
Thank
for the
you.
witness.
Mr. Sidumedi, any re-examination?
I can confirm, Chair, no examination.
Thank you. Mr. Roy, you are excused as a witness, and thank you for having come to give evidence.
Pleasure, ma'am.
Madam Chair, per the agreed order, if we may call upon Mr. Arsenio Cossa to be cross-examined, please.
Chair, I was just advised by the record, I must be on record. Chair, I confirm that we've got no re-examination questions for Mr. Mguni. And no
For Mr. Roy?
No, first Mr. Mguni.
Yes.
Secondly, I further confirm no re-examination question for Mr. Roy.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Sidumedi.
Mr. Kosa, again, give us your full names.
My name is Arsenio Cossa.
And you swear the evidence you are about to give us will be the truth, only the truth. And if you do, please raise your right hand and say, so help me God.
So help me God.
The witness is sworn in.
Thank you, Advocate Semenya. Ms. Subramani?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Good. Good afternoon, I think, Mr. Cossa. How are you?
Good, and you?
Fine, thanks. Mr. Cossa, this morning, we seek to elicit further information regarding your role as the City Power General Manager for the Inner City SDC. Mr. Cossa, in your statements and evidence given previously to this commission, you state that the Usindiso building was serviced by the Inner City Service Delivery Center. Is that correct?
Yes.
Will allow for translation.
Re Arsenio Cossa wile a coupe gore a ikane gore ta bua ba maruri me ga se sengwe gape fa se ba maruri me fa go ntse jalo a tsholetse seta sa re sa moja o na dira jalo me a re mo di monthuse so Moeledi o ne a tlhalosa gore ba batla go bona tshedimosetso e oketsegileng malebana le seabe sa gagwe mo City Power SDC jaaka motsamaisi. So potso ya ntlha ke gore Usindiso e ne e ka fa tlase ga tlhokomelo service ya bone. O ne a tlhalosa gore e go ntse jalo.
Mr. Kosa, do you agree that, per your evidence, part of these duties included tackling illegal connections, auditing buildings, and maintenance for the purpose of fulfilling your mandate?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. In your statement, you further set out that the SDC's customer base is cumulatively 32,746 customers, and this was broken down as 17,000 prepaid, 3,299 business, and 11,899 domestic customers. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Kosa, the team at the SDC is approximately 48 people on staff.
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Kosa, 48 people cannot effectively service an almost 33,000 customer base. Would you agree?
Yes, in terms of staff complement, yes, that's a challenge for the SDC.
So you would agree that the SDC is understaffed and has to efficiently allocate resources?
Yes.
Thank you. In such an instance, does the City of Johannesburg allocate resources to a service delivery center such as yourselves where there is such a need for additional staff?
No, I think that responsibility is entrusted to City Power. City Power as an organization is the one that facilitates that.
So
Mr. Promani, allow for interpretation.
My apologies.
Jaanong moeledi o ne a tlhalosa gore seabe sa bone kgotsa maikarabelo a lefapha la bone la SDC, Service Delivery Center, mo City Power la akaretsa go mekamekana le dikgokagano tsa motlakase tse di seng ka fa molaong, go kokoanya madi a go duela motlakase jalo le jalo. O ne a tlhalosa go ntse jalo. Jaanong ona a mmotsa gore SDC ene records a ikarabellang yone e na le bareki ba ba kana ka 32,700. 17,000 ke ba ile gore ba dirisa motlakase wa prepaid, 3,299 ke ba dikgwebo, mme 11,899 ke ba ile gore ba dirisa motlakase mo gae. Jaanong a ba mmotsa gore ba bereki ba thapiwa mo SDC ya bone ke batho ba le 48 a go ntse jalo. O ne a tlhalosa gore ba thapiwa ba 48. Jaanong o ne a mmotsa gore fa e le gore ba thapiwa ba 48 mme le na le bareki ba ba batlileng ba fitlha go 33,000, a jaanong babereki ba 48 ba kgona go fitlhelela kabo ya ditirelo go bareki ba batlileng go fitlha go 33,000. Records o ne a tlhalosa gore ke kgwetlho e re lebaneng le yone ka gonne re understaffed, ga rena babereki ba lekaneng go ka kgona go mekamekana le go aba tirelo mo bareking bano botlhe. Jaanong moeledi o mbotsa gore a jaanong COJ ya thusana ka go oketsa badiri kgotsa go thusa mo dikabelong tsa bone tse ba nang le tsone. O ne a tlhalosa gore nnyaa ga go nna jalo. City Power ke yone e ikarabellang mo go tlhomiseng gore kabo ya ditirelo tsa go fana ka motlakase ya diragadiwa. Ka jalo maikarabelo ano a kabo ya motlakase a wela ka tlhamalalo mo go bone.
Mr. Kosa, to then return to the issue of understaffing, then if City Power can allocate resources or additional members of staff, what is the process where an SDC such as yourself is comprised of 26 electricians, 15 trade assistants, and 7 team leaders to then service almost 33,000 customers?
Yes, so I think in addition to that, there's a statement on the statement. There is a line which talks to service providers. So our staff is also supplemented by service providers. But yes, that's the staff complement for the SDC, and that's the staff that we use to do our daily activities within the SDC. And where we need additional resources, we also do have other sections within City Power and the head office, where, if necessary, they also come and assist us. So that's how we manage our daily tasks within the SDC.
So if I understand correctly, the SDC itself is understaffed, but to complement or support that, City Power then allows for external service providers to allow you to assist.
Yes.
To be assisted, rather.
Yes.
Has the SDC ever applied for increased formal staffing as opposed to external service providers?
Maybe I don't get the question. Apply where in terms of what?
To City Power for formal staff as opposed to service providers.
Oh, okay. So as the SDC, we do have a formal structure that talks to the inner city SDC, and the people that we have actually populated or are stipulated on the statement are people who are occupying the existing positions within that structure at inner city SDC. So the structure as is, it accommodates those resources. So unless it gets expanded, then at this point in time, those are the resources it can accommodate. Thanks.
Allow for translation.
So mo le di ile botsa gore e reka ele City Power e ikarabelang ka go anamisa didirisiwa le bathapiwa. Jaanong le bereka jang lona mo SDC ya gago ya lona ka gonne tota le na le babereki ba ka nna ka electricians ba 26, trade assistants ba 16 jalo le jalo. Jaanong e reka le potlana jana mme le tshwanetse gore le direle le abe ditirelo go bareki ba fitlhang go 33,000 le kgona jang. So re khozana tlhalosa gore re na le se re se bitsang service provider supplement ka mafoko a mangwe ba ditirelo ba bangwe ba kgona go re thusa mo tirong ya rona e re dira gore kgone go aba ditirelo go bareki botlhe. Mme gape fa ile gore ba tlhoka bathapiwa ba boketsegile ba tlhoka matsogo a oketsegileng ba ka kgona go dira jalo ka go ikopela kwa ntlokgolo ya City Power mme ba kgona go tlisa babereki ba bangwe mo maemong a ile gore ba tlhoka. Jaanong mo le di bila botsa gore a SDC ya gagwe ga ise e dire kopo semolao ya gore go nne le bathapiwa ba oketsegileng go na le gore City Power e nne bone ba ile gore City Power kgotsa ba abi ba bang ba ditirelo ba thuse ka ba diri ka nako ile go ba tlhoka ka yone. Re khozana tlhalosa gore go na le dithulaganyo tsa semmuso tse di leng teng fa go tloa mo SDC ya bone tse di setseng di tladitswe. Jaanong go setse go na le batho ba ile gore ba dira dikabelo tsa bone go ya ka dithulaganyo tse ba nang le tsone mo teng ga SDC ya bone. Ntle fela le fa ile gore ya atolosiwa ke mo gongwe go ka dirang kopa gore bathapiwa ba bangwe ba ba oketsegileng batle go tla go thusa.
Thank you. Mr. Kosa, in relation to City Power's history with the Usindiso building, you do in your statement and in your evidence provide a timeline, including a discussion of the levels of termination. In 2021, you set out that City Power issued a pre-termination notice to Usindiso Ministries. Is that correct?
Yes.
In 2021?
Yes.
Mr. Kosa, the lease with Usindiso Ministries expired on 30 June 2013. Are you aware of this?
Nope.
Well, it had expired. Usindiso Ministries had factually vacated the property by 2016. We've heard in other evidence before this commission that once the lease had ended, Usindiso Ministries had ceased their operations after many years. Regardless of this lease, however, Mr. Kosa, the City of Johannesburg remained the owner of the property. why was a pre-termination notice issued to a tenant of the building where that lease had expired as opposed to the owner?
Well, I think when you look at that account, the account holder name, it comes as Usindiso Ministries. So even when the records are issued, they will come in that particular name. Yes.
Okay. Was a physical notice delivered to the property 14 days before the attempted disconnection? And I refer to that 14-day period as something accepted in case law as an acceptable period to ensure that the occupiers of a building are aware.
Yes. So based on my statement as well as the evidence that we've gathered, we do not have that on our records in terms of a person who received that pre-termination. But on our records, it's there that it has been issued, a pre-termination notice to the building.
So could we assume that this notice was affixed, or how was it properly served?
Say that again.
Are we to assume that it was affixed to the door of a building? How could we ascertain that it was properly served for the notice of the residents of the building?
Yes, I think in my previous talks here, I spoke about the different methods in which pre-termination gets issued to a customer. One is that it can be issued through an SMS, or it can be hand-delivered to a physical address, or even emailed if those details are there. So there are a number of methods in which that can be done. So once that's done and the customer doesn't respond, in other words, doesn't dispute that pre-term and doesn't come forward to say, I'm disputing, I've got a query and so forth, then a disconnection gets issued. So once a disconnection notice gets issued, that process would have been exhausted of issuing a pre-term. So that's how the process unveils when it comes to disconnections. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kasa.
So mo le dina botsa gore fa go tloa mo history ya city power le ka go ene ya Usindiso go ile gana le dikarolo tse di farologaneng tsa go kgaola motlakase ka sekai ka 2021 go ile ga romela pre-termination as a notice kwa ka go eno ya Usindiso Ministries a go ntse jalo records a ona are e go ntse jalo le fa go ntse jalo mo le dula tlhalosa gore tumalano ya go hira ka go eno ile ya felwa ke nako ka 30 June 2013 a ona itse seno ona tlhalosa gore nya ga le mo ga seno jaanong mo le di botsa gore fa ile gore tumalano ya go hira kago setse fitule ke nako ke ka ntlha yang fa ile gore pre-termination notice kgotsa kitsiso ya gore go tlile go kgaola motlakase e romela Usindiso Ministries mme le fa go ntse jalo monga kago e le toropo ya Johannesburg re khosa ona tlhalosa gore monga account ya motlakase wa kago eo ka go ya ka direkoto tsa bone ene e le Usindiso Ministries ke ka fo ile romelwa bone jaanong mo le di bila tla botsa gore a kitsiso eno ile a romelwa ka namana malatsi a le 14 pele ga gore go kgaole motlakase jaaka e le kitsiso ya teng jaaka go ka molao go tshwantse ga dirwa re khozana tlhalosa gore mo direkoteng tsa bone ga gona mo go bontshang teng gore gona le motho yo a ileng a amogela kitsiso e ka namana le fa go ntse jalo direkote tsa bone di bontsha gore kitsiso eo ile ya ntshiwa go ka ditekanyetso le ditaelo tsa ka fa di tshwantse go di dirwe ka teng jaanong mo le di botsa gore re tlhomisa jang gore kitsiso eo ya go kgaolwa ga motlakase ile a dirwa ka tsela e tshwanetseng ile a kgona go fetisiwa re khozana tlhalosa gore go na le dikgato di le mmalwa tse ba di dirisang gore ba tle ba romele kitsiso ya go kgaola motlakase ka sekai go ka dirisiwa SMS kgotsa go dirisiwa email ya monga account eo ka jalo fa morago ga go romela kitsiso eo ka mekgwa eo e farologaneng mme moreki a sa tsibogele kitsiso eo ka mafoko a mangwe a sa ngangisane ka yone kgotsa ganetsana ka yone kgotsa a botsa dipotso malebana le yone ke fo he mo ile gore jaanong ba diragatsa kitsiso eo ya go kgaola motlakase ka gore ba ye go kgaola motlakase go ka kitsiso eo.
Thank you. Mr. Costa, so if I understand the evidence you led and the evidence in your statement, then the procedure is as follows. After a billing query has been identified in the relevant department, the city then issues a technician notice to City Power. Thereafter, the process is initiated to disconnect electricity through the process of levels as you had described. Is that correct, in my understanding?
Not really. So what happens that the account holders or the people who manage the accounts are people at COJ, and we've got a department there which is credit control. So credit controls, they monitor the payment levels of customers and so forth. So then when they are not satisfied in terms of particular customer, in terms of what they owe or it's outstanding within their accounts, they then issue those preterms, and if they are not responded to, they then issue the disconnection notice. Then it comes to City Power. So we then effect the disconnection.
And then that disconnection is effected via your staff and or the service providers that you utilize. Is that correct?
It can be both. Can be either or both.
Okay. Mr. Kosa, it's clear from much of the testimony of the victims that there were various interactions with employees from City Power, whether they were members of staff or service providers. It's unclear, obviously, because of the passage of time. It is also additionally clear that the residents' version is that on occasion there were arrangements to pay City Power employees to assist in reconnections who had attended the building. Is there a way to trace where a team or technician was dispatched to effect disconnection, but there appeared thereafter to be a continued use of power as normal?
No, and I'm not aware of that.
Okay, so it can happen on a number of occasions, as was experienced by the residents of an Usindiso building, that a team is dispatched to the property, they arrived there, whatever arrangements were made, that team then left the building and no disconnection had been effected.
Yeah.
That's not outside of the realm of possibilities.
Yeah, I'm also not aware of that, and our visits to the property are recorded and are there on the statement. And what our resources encountered are also stated there, and I think they've clearly described on how they were received and so forth. So there's nothing of that nature in that statement.
A live translation.
So fa go tloa mo kgeng ya billing kgotsa sekoloto se moreki a tshwanetse se duele, moeledi o ile a tlhalosa gore toropo e romela ba di-technician gore di ye go kgaola motlakase kgotsa thulaganyo ke eng gore kwa bofelelong motho a kgaolele motlakase. Records ona e tlhalosa ka go ya ka ditatelano tsa teng gore seo se direga jang. Sa ntlha ona tlhalosa gore monga account sentletle o lebelelwa ke toropo ya Johannesburg mo le gore go na lefapha lephata le lengwe mo COJ le di bidiwang credit control ke bone ba ile gore ba leitlho tsela e le gore moreki o duela ka yone, mme fa ile gore ga ba kgotsofale tsela e a duelang ka yone ka mafoko a mang fa ile go sekoloto sa gago se kwa godimo thata mme ga gona dithulaganyo tsa di dirang gore a se duele, ke mo ba ile gore ba tlile go romela se re se bitsang pre-termination. Me go tswa foo fa e le gore moreki morago ga pre-term ga a bontshe dithulaganyo dipe tsa gore o tlile go duela motlakase, then credit control he e tlile go romela account eo go go bone go City Power gore ba ye go kgaola motlakase. Yaanong moledi o botsa gore batho ba ile gore ba ya he go kgaola motlakase a ke ba abi ba ditirelo ba ile go ba thusa kgotsa ke bathapiwa ba ka fa tlase ga city power o na tlhalosa gore e ka tswa e le ke bone bo babedi jaanong moeledi o ile a re dipego tse di tswang kwa baaging ba kago ba ile ba tlhalosa gore ka dinako dingwe ba tshwanela ko gore ba duele bathapiwa ba city power gore morago ga gore ba kgaole motlakase ba tle ba o busetse ba o gokaganya gape jaanong a gona le a records wa itse ka seno records ona tlhalosa gore nya ga a lemoge ebile ga itse ka seno mme jaanong moeledi a mmotsa gore a gona le tsela e le gore ba ka kgona go latedisa go kgaolwa ga motlakase ke di-technician mme gape ka nako eo e tshwanang motlakase o bobusediwa gape go bona gore a go na le dinako tse le go ba ka kgona go lemoga seno records ona tlhalosa gore nya ga itse ka seno ebile ga se lemoge jaanong o na tlhalosa records gore setlhopha se le gore se a go kgaola motlakase kgotsa se sa go gokaganya motlakase go sa kgatese go diregang fa se etela ka go eno go na le direkoto tse le gore di-statement tse di bontshang gore ba ile ko teng mme fa ba fitlha ko ba tshwanetse ba tlhalosa go ba dirile eng le go ba dirile jang jaanong se moeledi a na se botsa ke gore so ga bana tsela ya go bona gore a di-technician di kgona go ya ko lefelong la ba go kgaola motlakase mme gone ba boa ba sa go kgaola records e le tlhalosa gore nya ga itse ka seno ebile ga se lemoge ga ise a se lemoge.
Mr. Kasa, we've heard from many victims who've testified before this commission of the instances with some regularity of the power being disconnected and then reconnected so that power could be used again. Are there any systems in place within City Power or the SDC itself to detect the illegal consumption of electricity beyond tip-offs and planned or unplanned audits?
Yeah, not necessarily, because those are the means which we're currently using to determine if a customer that we have disconnected have now reconnected. I think above that, there's also what we call energy balancing, where we see where our high losses are in specific areas. And then that's when we then target those areas to go and audit and so forth. So those are the tools at our disposal that enable us to detect this. But other than that, we do not have any other intelligence that we can deploy to do so.
Okay. We'll have translation.
Yaanong moeledi o tlhalosa gore ba tsa setlhabelo ba le mmalwa ba tlile fano mme ba neela bosupi jwa gore go na le go sa tsamaisane sentle ga go kgaola le go gokagangwa ga motlakase ka mafoko a mangwe o tla itlhela gore motlakase o kgaotswe mo kagong ya bone le fa go ntse jalo fa nako e tsamaya ka bonakonyana fela o setse o buseditswe gape jaanong potso ke gore a ga bana thulaganyo epe e bana le yone e ka tswa e le mo City Power kgotsa mo SDC e le gore ba ka kgona go bona gore motlakase o dirisiwa kae le gone o dirisiwa ka go le kana kang segolo jang mo dikagong tse le gore motlakase ba itse gore o kgaotswe mo go tsone gongwe ka gore ba tle ba batle ba itsisiwe kgotsa ba lumwe tsebe ka gore motlakase o gokagantswe gape records ona tlhalosa gore ba dirisa thulaganyentseng jalo e le gore ba e tlhalosa moeledi mme gape se sengwe gape se le gore ba se dirisang ke se ba se bitsang energy balancing ke gore ba leba mafelo a ile gore go na le tiriso e kwa godimo thata motlakase le fa go ntse jalo madi a ba bonang a kwa tlase so ke se ba se bitsang high loss area ka jalo mafelo a ntseng jalo ke ona e le gore ba litlho ebile ba ya go one go tlhomamisa le go tlhotlhomisa gore ke eng se se diregang ko mafelong ano.
Thank you. Mr. Kasa, with respect to the Usindiso building itself and the disconnections performed, your statement makes note of a disconnection performed on 22 November 22, a further attempt to attend to the building on 27 July, and I also note on 24 August there was a further attempt.
26 July.
26 July. There was 26 July and a 27 July date in your
Correct.
statement.
Yes.
Given that there was still power after these multiple attempts, was there not a manner to escalate the issue beyond simply sending a team out where a disconnection was on paper set out, but then in reality illegal connections continued?
Right. So, on the 22nd of November, 2023.
2022.
2022, sorry, yes. So, on that particular one, we did disconnect level 3 successful, and evidence is there. So, then subsequent to that is the July 26, 27, 2023, where access was denied, and the last visit in August. So, what happens is that if a disconnection has been issued and we have not succeeded in doing so, we'll keep on sending our resources to go and try and disconnect. So, because that record still remains as not being disconnected. So, that end will happen, but in parallel to that, we then explore other means. In other words, we then notify other people who can assist us, either law enforcement agencies in the form of JMPD and police to assist us in organizing what we call operation. So that also depends on the availability of those entities for us to be able to effect. So depending on their schedule and the dates that they give us, we only be able to conduct those operations or disconnection based on their availability. But seemingly in that period, we do not have any schedule for us to do the operation.
So, Mr. Kosa, in respect of the Usindiso building, where there were multiple attempts to attend to the disconnection, it appears that a lack of resource beyond just the SDC's understaffing affected properly enforcing, addressing the illegal connection. Is that correct?
Well, I can talk for the SDC to say, well, we've got challenges in terms of resources. But well, even the resources that we send to go disconnect, if they get access, they will be in a position to disconnect. But beyond that, in terms of other entities, I think they can speak for themselves. But when they are busy or not available, then we are unable to then conduct what we want to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moeledi o ile a bua ka maiteko a SDC ya bo Rekhoza ile a leka go kgaola motlakase kwa kagong ya Usindiso. E ne le la ntlha ka 22 November 2022, gape ba ile ba ya ko ka di 26 le 27 July 2023, gape le ka 24 August 2023. Jaanong fa ba ne ba ntse ba ya ko, Moeledi o botsa gore a go ne go santse go na le motlakase na o tabogang, le gone a go ne go sena tsela e nngwe e le gore ba ka kgona go feteletsa kgang e kwa pele kwa ntle fela ga gore ba romele setlhopha ga go kgala motlakase. Rekhoza ona tlhalosa gore ka letlha la 22 November 2022 ba ile ba kgona go kgaola motlakase ka katlego go ya ka notice ya teng e leng level 3. So ba ile ba kgona go kgaola motlakase go ya ka level 3 ka letsatsi leo. Me fa ile ka di 26 le 27 July 2023 ba ile ba leka go tsena mo kagong, le fa go ntse jalo ba ile ba thibelwa ga ba ka ba kgona go tsena mo kagong. Jaanong ona tlhalosa gore fa notice e ntshitswe ya gore ba tshwanetse go kgaola motlakase mme ba sa atlege go dira jalo, e ka tswela go ba thibetse go tsena mo kagong kgotsa ka mabaka ape fela ba tla nna ba tswelela ba leka go ya ko kagong e go go thibe kgotsa go kgaola motlakase. Mme ka dinako dingwe fa ile gore ga ba kgone go tsena mo kagong, ba tlile go itsise ditheo tse dingwe gore ba ba thuse, ditheo tse di jaaka JMPD le SAPS. Me fa ba tla ke se ba se bitsang ba re ke operation e le gore ba e dira, mme gone go ikaegile ka gore ditheo tseo di teng le go ka thusa. Ka jalo ba ikaegile ka gore ditheo tseno e leng badiragatsi ba melao jaaka ACPS kgotsa JMPD ba ba fe maatla le go ba na dithulaganyo tsa bone gore ba tlile go nna teng le go ka ba thusa mme ba tsamaisana go ya ka dithulaganyo tse di tswang ko ditheong tseo tse di tlileng go ba thusa. Moeledi o ile a botsa jaanong gore fa go tloa mo kagong e jaaka Usindiso re ka re bona gore dikgokaganyo tsa motlakase e ne e setse di ka fa molaong a re ka re go tlhaela ga di dirisiwa ntle fela le go se nne le bathapiwa ke gone go ile ga baka mathata re khozana a tlhalosa gore o tlile go buelela SDC ya bone fela mme ditheo tse dingwe ba ka ne ba ipuelela fa ile SDC ya bone fela ba ne ba tlhaela ka di dirisiwa le fa go ntse jalo fa fela bana ba ka kgona go tsena mo dikagong ba sa thibele ga go pelele gore bana ba tla kgona go dira go kgaola motlakase ka katlego mme fa ile ditheo tse dingwe o tla ba tlogela gore e ne bone ba ipuelelang mme gone SDC ya bone fa bana ba ka kgona go tsena mo kagong bana ba tla kgona go kgaola motlakase ka katlego.
Thank you. Mr. Kosa, the city.
Mr. Subrayan,
yes. Are we?
you are approaching dangerous terrain. Your cross-examination is limited to 30 minutes.
Okay. If I may ask one final question, and then I will
Yes.
allow Mr. Kosa. Mr. Kosa, the city as the owner of the property, where, as you noted earlier in this cross-examination, the termination notices had been issued to Usindiso Ministries, the previous tenant. Was the city as the owner on paper ever notified of these termination notices or disconnections?
Well, I'm not in a position to, I'm not aware of any of that, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kosa. And apologies for going over, Madam Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Bryan.
We have no questions to the witness.
Potso ya bofelo moeledi a le botsa ke gore jaaka toropo e le monga kago go ya ka dipampiri le fa gone kitsiso ile a romela Usindiso Ministries a toropo ile ya itsisiwe ka go romelwa ga kitsiso e ya go kgaola motlakase re khozana ona tlhalosa gore ga mo seemo sa go ka araba ke ka jalo ga a lemoge ebile ga itse ka seno.
Any re-examination, Mr. Sidumedi? Again, on record.
This time around, Chair, I do have two questions just for...
Yes, you may.
Mr. Kosa, just starting from the last questions that you asked. On your statement, you attached an account. And in that account, meaning a billing account, an invoice. It says there, account name, Usindiso Ministries.
Yes.
Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Do you know between who would have opened, if the account name says Usindiso, who would have opened that account?
Well, based on my experience, then that would be the customer or the occupant of the building or the owner of the building.
So in this regard,
COJ.
because
I'm saying that would have been the owner or the occupant of the property who would have done so with COJ. And
So-
hence the account comes bearing that name.
of Usindiso.
Yes.
Do you know if Usindiso, when they vacated the premise, did they notify City Power that they are closing the account?
No, we do not have those records, and I'm not aware of any of those notices.
Okay. Speaking to the issue of the disconnections, a proposition was put to you that occupants of the building made arrangements with persons that were disconnecting power. Remember that?
Yes.
In the event that a customer or an occupant seek to make arrangements regarding reconnection, who must they speak to?
They need to speak to COJ, credit control, if they want to make those arrangements for reconnection, be it to settle the account or to enter into an AOD or to dispute any of the billing that will be within the account.
To your knowledge, did any of the occupants of Usindiso or Usindiso itself make any arrangements with COG regarding the reconnections?
We do not have that on our records. It has not been done.
Lastly, in terms of resources, we have spoken about the resources that the SDC has. We refer to the 2 or 3 attempts, 26 and 27, and sometime in August,
Yes.
where there were attempts to reconnect, to disconnect. Did you have resources to go on site to disconnect?
Yes, as I've said earlier on that those particular resources, when they did those visits, had they been granted access or not being threatened, they would have effected a disconnection successful.
So the only reason why you could not disconnect was you were hampered by the occupants of the building.
Correct.
Thank you, Chair.
So dipotso tse di latelang moeledi o ile a di botsa le dikarabo ne le ka tsela eno gore fa go tloa mo billing account leina la account ya kago eno ke mang ya re ke Usindiso Ministries jaanong potso ke gore ke bo mang ba ile gore ba ka tswa ba ile ba bula account eo re khosana tlhalosa go ya ka maitemogelo a gagwe e tshwanetse ya bo e le monga ka go kgotsa moreki wa motlakase yo le gore o ile a bula account le COG jaanong fa ile gore moeledi o ile a botsa gore fa ile gore Usindiso ile ya kgaotsa go nna moreki ba ile ba itsisi COG gore ba ile ba tlile go tswala account re khoza ga tlhomisega ka tseno ka seo ga itse ka seno jaanong moeledi o ile a botsa gore go tsa o ile a re ba go ile go utlwela gore baagi ba ka go eno ba ile ba dira dithulaganyo tse di rileng le di-technician fa ba ne ba tlile go kgaola motlakase gore ba tle ba duele jalo le jalo jaanong potso ke gore tota ba tshwanetse go ba bue le mang fa go dira dithulaganyo tse ntseng jalo tsa go duela re khoza o ile a re ba tshwanetse go ba bue le COG le ka fa tlase ga lephata la bone la credit control fa ile gore ba na le kganetsano ngangisano kgotsa thulaganyo epe ya go duela e ba karata go e dira malebana le sekoloto sa motlakase ba tshwanetse gore ba buisane le credit control re sedumedi moeledi o ile a botsa gore go ya ka rekhoza go ya ka ene a o itse fa ile gore Usindiso ile a dira dithulaganyo dipe fela le COG tsa go duela sekoloto sa bone rekhoza o na tlhalosa gore ga bana thulaganyo eo kgotsa pego epe mo direkotong tsa bone jaanong re sedumedi moeledi o ile a botsa gape gore ka nako ya fa le ne le ka go kgaola motlakase jaaka ka August bošeng jaana a le ne le na le didirisiwa tse di lekaneng go ka kgona go diragatsa tiro ya lona re khoza na tlhalosa gore ba ne ba na le didirisiwa tse di lekaneng mme gone ga ba kgona go tsena mo kagong ka ntlha go bo bane ba tshosediwa kgotsa ba ile ba thibelwa jaanong fa moeledi a botsa gore fa fela e le go bana ba ka kgona go tsena mo kagong a bana ba ka kgona go diragatsa thumo bone re khoza o na tlhalosa gore fa fela bana ba ka kgona go tsena mo kagong kwa ntle ga dithibelo dipe ba ne ba ka kgona go diragatsa thumo ya bone ya go kgaola motlakase.
Chair, there are no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sidumedi. Mr. Kosa, you are excused as a witness, and thank you for having come to give evidence.
Thank you, Chair.
Ms. O'Brien?
Madam Chair, I see that we're about 10 minutes away from 1. I don't know if it would be an appropriate time to break or if...
You may proceed.
I might proceed. All right. Apologies. If we may then call, it's fine. Mr. Amiyameni to be called as a witness.
Advocate Semenya.
Please give us your full names again.
Mongameli Mnyameni.
Do you swear the evidence you're about to give us will be the truth, nothing else but the truth? If you do, please raise your right hand and say, so help me God.
So help me God.
The witness is sworn in.
Thank you, Advocate Semenya. Mr. Prayer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Mnyameni.
Hello.
Mr. Mnyameni, today we seek to elicit a response for further information regarding your knowledge of the Usindiso building in connection with your role as the ward councillor in the area that the Usindiso building was in. Mr. Mnyameni, you state that Ward 124 is the biggest ward in Region F of Johannesburg and that you were elected in 2017. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Part of those duties would include improving the ward and ensuring the provision of municipal services, as well as communicating the interests of the constituents of your ward upwards. Is that correct?
Correct.
I'll allow for translation.
Ye uqale ufakazi olandelayo umnumzana uMnyameni ngokuthi enze izifungo ukuthi uzokhuluma iqiniso ngokuthi aphakamise isandla sakhe sangokwesekudla athi inkosi ingisize. Ubeke umeli esekubeka phambi kwakhe ukuthi into ayifunayo njengoba bezoqhubeka nalolu daba ukuzama ukuthola ulwazi nendima yakhe njengekhansela lale ward. Ukubeke phambi kwakhe ukuthi le ngokusho kwakhe ufakazi umnumzana uNyameni ukuthi le ward iward number 124 ingenye yama ward amakhulu kakhulu ngesikhathi kwenzeka lesi sigameko akuvumile ufakazi ukuthi kunjalo ube futhi esebeka nemisebenzi nendima yenzayo ukuthi inhloso yakhe njengekhansela enye yazo ukuthuthukisa ukusebenza thuthukisa le ndawo engaphansi kwamandla akhe kanye nokudlulisela izikhalo noma kubantu abangaphezulu kwakhe uma kukhona izinto ofuna ukuzidlulisela yena umxhumanisi uyozithathayo ayodlulisela kulabo abangaphezulu ube sevuma ufakaza ukuthi omunye wemndima yakhe ukwenza kanjalo.
Mr. Mnyameni, in performing your duties as a ward councillor for Ward 124, is it correct that you had knowledge of the issues relating to the Usindiso building through communications from residents?
Yes.
Thank you. Is it also correct that through various community policing forums and direct communication with yourselves, you became involved with the constituents in the building insofar as communications with them regarding their concerns?
Yes.
Thank you. In your role as ward councillor, you're able to escalate the issues you identify on the ground towards higher levels up to the city. Is that correct?
Correct.
And part of those responsibilities were identifying certain risks posed to the communities in your area. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. I'll pause for translation.
Ubeke nje esembuza imbuzo cishe emine lapho yonke lembuzo ayivume ngokuthi kunjalo. Umbuzo wokuqala ube ukuthi indima yakhe njengekhansela okuqala nje bekuwukuthi ubazi yini ukuthi kwenzekani lapha ya kule bhilidi umnumzane ufakazi uMnyameni uthe yebo ubekwazi lokho okunye futhi yena njengoba besebenza lapha ubezithatha yini lezo zinto azidlulisele kulabo abangaphezulu ukuthi lapha ya kunalokho kwenzekayo izigameko ezenzeka khona ube esevuma futhi ukuthi nalapho ubekwenza lokho akudlulisele kwaba ngaphambili ngezingozi ebezikhona futhi lapha kuleli ability ubezazi futhi azidlulisele kulabo abafanele ukuthi bazisingathe yonke lembuzo uyivumile ufakaza ukuthi cha ubekwazi konke.
Mr. Mnyameni, in a report relating to the fire, you are described as a key stakeholder. Would you consider that classification for both Usindiso building or any building in your ward? Would you be a stakeholder to the interests of those buildings and their residents?
Yes, I would be a stakeholder.
Thank you. And this also extended to the actual disaster, where you do explain that you attended the site of the fire thereafter to provide support. Is that correct?
Correct.
Correct. Mr. Mnyameni, in your evidence, you relate instances of engaging with other arms of the city, such as Pick It Up and the JNPD, in terms of the waste management or crime and community policing forums. In those engagements, you clearly identified risks posed by the Usindiso building. Is that correct?
Correct.
And how did you escalate these concerns, rather, beyond engaging with Pick It Up and JMPD? Did you escalate further once those attempts had the effect that to the limitations, the limited effect that they could have?
I escalate to JPC as a property of the JPC.
Thank you. I do note that you...
I think you must allow for interpretation
My
now.
apologies.
Thank you, Chair. Ubeke esechaza ngokombiko ukuthi umbiko ummeli umxolo ummeli uchaze ngalombiko ukuthi umbiko ubiza ufakazi njengomuntu oyi key stakeholder, ngamanye amazwi uthinteka kakhulu yena umuntu ongumbambi iqhaza oyinhloko kulokho uvumile ufakazi ukuthi yebo kunjalo, wambuza ukuthi la kwezinye izindawo kunjalo yini, ingaba ngabhekwa njenge key stakeholder, uvumile ukuthi kunjalo ezintweni ezinjengokusekela uma kwenzeka umlilo uyena mvamisa ohamba phambili othinteka kakhulu lapho. Ubeke kodwa manje ummeli esemphinde mbuza ukuthi kuvelile futhi efakazini bakho ukuthi uye waxhumana waba nengxoxo nabanye noma ezinye izinhlaka zikahulumeni ezithintekayo lapha eminye iminyango njenge Pick It Up, JMPD ngobugebengu babenzeka kuleli bhilidi. Uvumile ufakazi ukuthi yebo ukwenzile lokho wakudlulisela kulabo abathintekayo. Ubese mbuza ke manje ukuthi kodwa ke manje ngaphandle kwalezi ingxoxo ne Pick It Up, JMPD nezinye inhlaka kukhona yini lapho oke wayidlulisela khona ke futhi kwabanye lezi lolu daba lwangagcina kulaba, yilapho ufakazi eshilo ukuthi cha udlulisile ngokwesibonelo udlulisile kuyi JPC.
Mr. Mnyameni, in your statement, your initial statement rather, and I make the distinction, Madam Chair, because this morning there was a further witness statement handed up regarding Mr. Mnyameni for clarification on certain issues, but I will not refer to them just yet.
Yes.
In your initial statement, Mr. Mnyameni, you state that you became aware of the Usindiso building first in 2018. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that at the time you were aware, it related to an issue regarding the structural integrity of the building. Is that correct?
Correct.
You understood that the whole, and I'm going to quote, that the whole building was a hazard and that there was a need to remove the women that were resident in the Usindiso building. Is that correct?
Correct.
From your statement, it is clear that there was an awareness of the structural risks of the Usindiso building, both at a ward level, but also at a mayoral level, where you relate that part of that awareness came from mayoral intervention. Is that correct?
Correct.
I take it that that attempted intervention was not successful.
No, it was not, in particular at the shelter, but at the other side of the building it was successful because everybody that were working in that clinic, then the nurses were evacuated. It was closed.
Okay, thank you.
Allow for interpretation.
Ube futhi eseqhubeka ngestatimende sakhe lapho eyambuza khona cishe imibuzo yonke abelekwe eyivuma ufakazi ukuthi kunjalo. Ngokwesibonelo umbuzo oqala okunye akubeke phambi kwakhe ukuthi umnumzane ufakazi umnyameni wazi ngaleli bhilidi isimo salo ngonyaka ka2018 lapha avumile khona ufakazi ukuthi kunjalo. Wazi futhi ukuthi leli bhilidi isimo salo isakhiwo salo asikho esimweni esikahle, nalapho futhi uvumile ukuthi wabe sekwazi lokho, futhi wazi ngalo lonke ibhilidi ukuthi alikho esimweni kufanele abantu bakhishwe kulona ilokho futhi ayekwazi nezingozi zalo. Ube futhi esesho ukuthi lolu daba akwangasandiwana nje udaba olithinta yena njengekhansela kodwa lwaselwaziwa ngisho nayi imeya ngokwalo lwaselidlulele esigabeni semeya. Kodwa ke ube sethi ummeli kubonakala sengathi kodwa zonke lezi zinto azange ziphumelele lezi zingxoxo zayo yonke lesimo. Ufakazi uphendulile ukuthi cha kwaphumelela uhafu wayo akuphumelelanga konke ngoba leli bhilidi ngapha eceleni lalinomtholampilo. Ngasohlangothini lomtholampilo kwaphumelela lokho ababekwenza ngoba bakwazi ukuvala umtholampilo babakhipha abantu kodwa ngasendabeni yebhilidi ngokwalo abazange baphumelele ngoba abantu babaqhubeka behlala kuwona baphumelela ohlangothini olulodwa kuphela lomtholampilo.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I do see it's 1 o'clock. Would it be an appropriate
Yes.
time to break?
Yes. We'll take a lunch adjournment and reconvene at 2 o'clock.